Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Building Resilience and Adapting to Climate Change Impacts for Drinking Water and Wastewater Utilities. Today's topic is Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness Tool Training, Session 1. My name is Alfredo Lagos with GDIT. I will be serving as an instructor for today's webinar. This CREAT training focuses on what's called the Southeast Climate Region. Really quickly, I did want to introduce the EPA folks that have been leading the charge. Kurt Baranowski and Steve Freeze, as you can see their names there. They're with US EPA headquarters, and they lead what's called the CREW initiative, and CREW, C-R-W-U, stands for Creating Resilient Water Utilities, and they are sponsoring the CREAT training webinar series that we're doing. I also want to reintroduce myself. Again, my name is Alfredo Lagos with GDIT. GDIT provides contract support to EPA's Water Security Division and the CREW initiative. I've been helping and working as an instructor with the CREAT trainings for several years now, doing them originally in person pre-pandemic, and now we've kind of switched over to the virtual realm, and really looking forward to working with everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to ask my colleague Mary Jo Krikorian from GDIT to come off mute. And Mary Jo, when you're ready, if you want to introduce yourself.
Great, thank you, Alfredo, and good morning, everyone. This is Mary Jo Krikorian from GDIT as well. And as Alfredo mentioned, he and I have traveled around the country to conduct all these in-person CREAT trainings, but since things changed, we have switched to this webinar format, and it has really opened it up to a very wide audience with over hundreds of people attending these sessions at this point. So I also manage the team of programmers that update the CREAT application. So we are really excited to show you all the great functionality and capabilities of this tool over the next few weeks.
All right, great. Thank you, Mary Jo. Appreciate that. Also, just want to call out a couple more people that are working behind the scenes to make all this possible. One is our webinar manager for today. Her name is Ann Weiscarver. You might have seen Ann's name on a lot of the emails, the reminder emails that came from GoToWebinar. And Ann is going to be watching over the questions panel. So again, if you have any questions or comments, please submit them, whether technical or non-technical in nature. Ann will be there to kind of respond. And then also working on the tech support side is Brian Redding. He's available at that phone number that we provided at the beginning. That's 703-399-3243. Brian's there to help out and make sure people are connected, can see the screen, can hear, and they're good to go. So again, please take advantage of us, I guess, and submit any questions you have and comments. And if you've got technical issues, submit those in that questions panel or call. We can help out. Also, I do want to thank our many sponsors. They're all listed there on the screen with their logos, but they helped to plan and devise the training and get the word out, and they've been with us all along the way. We couldn't do it without them, so huge shout out to them. That includes the Alabama Rural Water Association, the Georgia Rural Water Association, the Kentucky Rural Water Association, the Mississippi Rural Water Association, the Tennessee Association of Utility Districts, the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, the National Association of Water Companies, and the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So again, thank you to all of our sponsors. Really appreciate it. Okay, here is on screen the CREAT training schedule overview. This training builds on what was called or is called the introductory session webinar for drinking water and wastewater utilities that was held just about 3 weeks ago in May 2021. And that intro session, if you didn't join us for it, covered just real general projections for climate for the Southeast climate region. It introduced the EPA CREW initiative. Again, that's Creating Resilient Water Utilities. And it featured a case study, a local case study on someone that's actually used CREAT, and we're going to get into that a little bit more over this next coming series. But if you haven't seen that, we will be providing the link to that webinar after today's webinar is a follow-up email. So if you missed it, there's an opportunity to check it out. It was really good. It turned out great. So what is this training all about? Well, as you can see on the screen, there's a table in the middle with 3 columns. On the left is the session. On the middle is date and time. On the right is the training topics. We are in session 1. We're going to start to do an in-depth deep dive look at what's called CREAT, the Climate Resilience Evaluation Awareness Tool. And so we're going to dive into it. Today, we're going to start with an overview and then modules 1 and 2. There's 5 modules total. So this Thursday, session 2, we're going to dive into module 3 and 4. And then next Tuesday, that's June 22nd, we're going to wrap it up with module 5. And we're going to have a guest speaker talk about available local financial resources to fund adaptation measures. Session 4 is a couple of weeks after session 3. It's going to be June 6th. That's a Tuesday, same time as you can see for all of these sessions, 10 to 12 Eastern. And that final session is going to be an open agenda for attendees to ask questions on how to use CREAT, how to apply it to their circumstances, and questions on financing, funding, your resilience and adaptation strategies. Will also feature for session 3 and 4 guest speakers to kind of go through that topic because we think that's more interesting for folks. The goal, as you can see at the bottom of the screen here, is for attendees to start your own risk assessment using CREAT. And so we're going to be using a variety of means to help you achieve that goal. We're going to be using poll questions, homework, which I'll talk about in a sec, the instructions, we're going through the slides and things, and then that session 4, which is that open session for folks to join us if they want. It's an open session, so you don't, as we'll talk about, you don't necessarily have to join us for that, but we think it'll be a good one. Okay, here is the agenda for today. We're going to do that CREAT overview. We'll introduce quickly the 5 modules of CREAT, and then we'll start the deep dive. We'll do module 1. We'll start to dig into module 2, and that's where we're going to leave it with the modules. We'll leave 10 minutes at the end to go through the next homework assignment and some closing remarks, and just leave the lines open for any questions. I mentioned earlier there's homework, and no one likes that word, but we did provide some handouts and some materials starting last week for those that signed up a while ago. Anybody that just signed up recently, you would have gotten the email over the last couple of days. But basically, we sent an email that included a series of documents that are shown here on the screen. The most important one being what's called the homework handout. That's an 8-page document that includes the little tiny simple homework assignments for you to do that'll again help you achieve your goal. Most importantly too, it included information on help. The bottom of page 1 on that homework handout in a big box is how to get help, phone numbers and emails. So please take advantage of that. We also included the session agendas in case you want to know when we start, when we end, what we're going to cover. That's there in that email I sent you. We also sent a CREAT file, which we'll dig into, and what's called an input guide. Both of these things will help you, again, sort of follow step by step what we're doing on screen. We also provided a financial resources handout that's going to make more sense during sessions 3 and 4, so not much to say about it currently. And the final 3 documents that not only did we email to you, but they're also in that handouts panel. They're just general information about the CREW program and CREAT documents, one in particular called the CREAT infographic that just kind of a 1-pager. It's in the bottom left corner, shows the 5 modules of CREAT. Super handy to just print out if you've got availability of a printer, and use that to follow along when you're doing your own assessment. Again, the big thing is if you get lost at any time, please come to us. We're here to help over these next couple of weeks to get you to achieve that goal of doing your own assessment. Last couple of things I want to show you guys before we get into the overview. Just a quick overview of folks that have signed up for the training, a little bit about you all. This first chart here is the types of organizations that have registered. As you can see, starting from the top, working our way clockwise around, it's mostly utilities, which is awesome. That's our target audience, among others. So it's drinking water, wastewater, stormwater utilities, and combined systems. And then on the left side, we've got technical assistance providers, state and federal agencies, and then other. And in this case, that includes like local government, conservation departments, environmental consultants, wholesale water providers. So a nice mix. This next slide is going to show you guys the population size served, represented by those utilities. So we've got a mix starting at the top, working our way clockwise. We've got very small and small, mediums, there's a good representation, same with large and very large. So again, a really nice spread of systems, and this CREAT tool, as you guys will learn, is applicable for utilities of all sizes and communities and other folks that aren't owners and operators, as you'll see. We did ask, have you conducted any extreme event or climate adaptation planning at your organization? A lot of people said no, but a lot of people said yes. So welcome to both sides of this coin. We're hoping to kind of show you some new things. And for those that have done this sort of thing, we'd love to hear more about what you've gotten up to. And there'll be opportunities for that to happen. And then the last thing we wanted to ask when you guys registered was what are some potential extreme weather or future environmental condition impacts that you're most concerned about at your organization? Again, starting at the top and going clockwise, folks mentioned changing precipitation patterns, drought, floods, those got a lot of votes. Greater storm intensity got a lot of votes. Water quality degradation or harmful algal blooms, also a lot of votes. And then under the other piece of the pie there, folks indicated urban flooding, tornadoes, tropical storms, hurricanes, sanitary sewer overflows, and earthquakes. So thanks everyone for chiming in on that. And that actually leads us to our first poll question. So this is our way of interacting with everybody that's joining us. And Anne, I'm going to ask Anne, our webinar manager, to go ahead and launch that first poll. This one is really simple. Have you used CREAT? It's a web-based risk application. Has anyone used it before? Yes, no, or unsure. And we'll give everyone, like 10 seconds or so to answer this one. Pretty straightforward question. All right, and you can go ahead and close it. We'll just take a quick look at the results, and then we will move on. And this will help us get a good sense. Okay, the majority was no. Okay, not a surprise. That's why we're here. So thanks again for joining us. So Anne, you can go ahead and close that, and I will move us forward to the next slide. And I will ask Mary Jo Krikorian if you could come off mute. I will now transfer responsibilities to you, I guess.
Great, thanks, Alfredo. Again, this is Mary Jo, and I'm going to provide you an overview of the CREAT application before we really dive into all the details and how to actually use the tool. So over these next 3 training sessions, as Alfredo mentioned, we will progress through the 5 modules, which will help your utility plan, prepare, and build resilience to a changing climate. So as we learned from the polling question, over 88% of you, I think, have never used CREAT, and 6% of you are unsure. So this will all be new to you. But for those of you who maybe have used CREAT previously, we did recently deploy a new version with many cool enhancements and updated climate data. CREAT is very easy to use and supports making the case for investment in resilience by comparing your implementation costs to risk reduction to assist in your decision making. So CREAT uses 5 modules, as we mentioned, to guide users step by step and sequentially building on the inputs of each module. The modules are climate awareness, scenario development, consequences and assets, adaptation planning, and risk assessment. And so today we are going to cover modules 1 and 2 in depth. So it'd be very easy to make decisions to protect our utility if we could predict the future, right? So CREAT helps users to identify how changing climate conditions could exacerbate current threats or perhaps introduce new threats to your infrastructure and operations. Projected climate data will allow us to examine scenarios such as how much hotter and drier or warmer and wetter the future may be. So by understanding how climate might change in the future, utilities can identify strategies to protect critical assets. By definition, and you'll hear a lot about this in the future sessions, adaptive measures are any actions or strategies to protect critical assets and mitigate the impacts of those threats. CREAT has a very robust adaptive measure library with default cost data that you can choose to use to build your adaptation plans, or you can always add in and enter in custom information. So this graph is a very simplified version of what we are building in our CREAT risk assessment, and we'll come back to this a lot. As you can see on the x-axis, there are bars displaying the current climate conditions and bars showing future climate conditions. The y-axis shows the cost of impacts. Now, if you look at the purple bar, that shows the cost without adaptation, whereas the red bar shows how costs can increase if the climate conditions get worse. If you implement an adaptive measure, you can reduce the cost of impacts, as you can see with the yellow and green bars. The yellow bar is what we refer to as the no regrets option, because even if your climate conditions don't change or get worse in the future, there is still a monetized risk reduction. So this graph is actually what we're going to see when we complete our CREAT risk assessment in Module 5, and we're going to keep showing you this over and over and how we are building this end result. We're going to explain what each component means and just show you how each module ends up building this graph. So this is one of the key decision-making results that you might use to discuss with your stakeholders or board members, operators, any of your staff. CREAT does help users make decisions about which adaptation strategies to implement by comparing the cost of adaptation with the potential cost of impacts. So as you can see, if your cost to impact is less than your cost of impacts, then that's a good decision. You should probably go ahead and implement that. If the cost to adapt is a lot greater than your cost of impacts, then that's probably an adaptive measure that you should not go ahead and do right away, if ever. If the cost to adapt is about the same as the cost of impacts, then that might be a consider implementing or wait and see situation. So in addition to the overall cost comparison, CREAT does prompt you to consider the likelihood that threats will occur and if your strategies still make sense to implement. Some strategies, as I mentioned before, might be no regrets that would be beneficial even if conditions stayed the same. And additionally, at the end, you're encouraged to qualitatively consider other factors relating to implementing the strategies, such as energy costs, if they'll go up, funding availability, and other socioeconomic factors. So CREAT offers these really great interim summary reports after each module that we will show you that can be used to inform key stakeholders or decision makers. There are also data exports to Excel, which is my area of expertise, and I love all the data, so you can review and compare the data. And at the end of your CREAT assessment, there's also an overall plan summary report that contains all of the information. And all of these reports are in Word format, so you can just use sections for your purposes if you want to pull them into presentations or your own reports. So who uses CREAT? I hope after these training sessions, all 35 of you right now will be added to this list. A lot of different utilities and communities have used CREAT, and as you viewed in the opening slide as to who is in this training session, CREAT's used by a great range of utilities, large, medium, small, very small, water, wastewater, stormwater, and different threats and concerns. If you had a chance to review the pre-training homework, as Alfredo and I keep mentioning, the EPA case study and information exchange website does provide examples for different threats and locations. So today we're going to be looking at the Porch Band of Creek Indians in Alabama for our training example, but I do encourage you to surf around these different case studies and reports on this site. There's a lot of really great information. As you start your CREAT assessment, like we mentioned, the end goal is for you to develop your own CREAT assessment. It is best to have a team to help you with any additional information. Sometimes that knowledge might just be contained with one person, but often it's really helpful to get more detailed information like how much an adaptive measure cost or will cost, if it's something that was done many, many years ago, or if it's going to be done in the future. So you might want to get others on your team to help with your CREAT assessment. So, and finally, if you did attend that introductory session webinar that we mentioned back in May, we showed you the CREAT Climate Scenarios Projection Map. This is another very helpful EPA crew resource to review before starting your CREAT assessment. So our goal is that over these next 3 or 4 sessions, if you do join us on that last one, you will start to think about questions you might have and what you might want to include in your own CREAT assessment file. And with that, I will hand it back over to Alfredo. And I think we have a polling question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mary Jo. Yeah, And if you could launch our next poll question, and while this is coming up, I'll just give everyone a heads up on what it is. So this is, what topic would you like to learn most about during the training? I believe you've got one choice here. We know we're sort of penning you in, but if you want to take maybe, we'll give you guys like 10 to 15 seconds to answer this one. Are you interested in projected climate data, adaptation strategies? Again, those are anything that's going to reduce your vulnerability, your risk. They can take many different forms. Are you interested in successful resilience planning efforts like case studies, or do you want to know more about risk assessment and reducing your risk, or funding, which isn't always like the greatest, most exciting topic, but maybe that's for you. So okay, and go ahead and close it out. Let's take a quick look, and this will help us to figure out what you guys are all interested in. It looks like a nice spread, so a lot of case studies and adaptation strategies. So great, thank you everyone for responding to the poll. This will be one of several that we're gonna launch today, so thank you. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just jump right into our first module. This is module 1, climate awareness, and we're just going to start the deep dive. So this is that risk assessment process. Mary Jo just showed it, but it's sort of formatted a little bit differently. There's the 5 modules. Then they're organized from left to right. We're going to complete them in order. That doesn't mean you need to complete them all at once. We're obviously doing this kind of quickly, if you will, on today's training, Thursdays and next Tuesdays, but you have more time if you need it and you don't feel like you need to be rushed. So this is here are the 5 modules. We'll complete them in order. The first one is climate awareness, and that's step 1 in the risk assessment process. This module is going to provide basic information about climate impacts and allows you to enter some general information about your utility. And that general information is going to be really, really basic stuff like your location, the type of utility you are if you're an owner operator, but if you're a technical assistance provider or consultant or someone else, imagine the utilities in your community, the ones you serve, you'll enter basic information about that, and that's going to help us to start our analysis, and it's going to come back to help us later on. The overall goal is shown here on the screen. It's to increase awareness of climate impacts for your utility's location, to help inform future assessment inputs and decisions. So I mentioned earlier, you're going to input some location information and information about the utility in question that you want to look at, and all this info is going to help provide climate and economic data that's behind the scenes in CREAT. We're not going to really open the hood a lot of CREAT because we just don't have that time, but we will give you resources for anyone that does want to kick the tires, raise it up on a lift, look underneath the body and see how it all works. But rest assured that there are some great resources built into CREAT, which we're going to be able to tap into, and all that's going to support your assessment. And you can do multiple assessments. You can start assessments and stop them and come back. There's a lot of flexibility here, but this will be the beginning of all that. And as part of Module 1, you're going to be able to review some climate resources. For example, there's a 2014 National Climate Assessment, and it breaks up the country into different climate regions, the Southeast region being one of those. And you can get a sense of, if you're not sure where to start, to figure out, okay, what has happened to me in the past? What am I interested in? What do I think might occur in the future that could maybe be worse or might put me into a bind on my infrastructure or my operations, my services, the community I support. So this is a good way to kind of get you started on this process and get that critical thinking, put your thinking cap on. So one of the ways that we're going to do this is actually working with a utility in order to show you guys and demonstrate CREAT. So we have to work with some data to do that. And Mary Jo mentioned it, we're going to be working with the Porch Band of Creek Indians Utility Authority. They're out of Atmore, Alabama. They're about 8 miles northwest of Atmore, Alabama. It's in rural Escambia County. That's about 57 miles east of Mobile. For those in the know with Alabama, you can kind of see them on the lower right corner map of some of the federally recognized Indian tribes in the Southeast region. If you look at Alabama, you can see the Porch Band of Creek Indians there. And the system employs 14 people or so. It's on the smaller side, if you will. They serve approximately 300 water and sewer connections in and around the reservation. They also formed the Escambia Community Utilities to manage and own utility systems off reservation. That's an additional 500 connections. So overall, we're talking 6,400 people in their service area, specifically on the wastewater. They do water and wastewater. That's why it says combined wastewater there. And they average 2.1 million gallons per day on the treatment side. And they did share with us that they've got several different concerns when we were sort of getting ready for today's training on the wastewater side. And that's the image I just had come up on the slide. This is their wastewater kind of system, their collection system. And they indicated when they were working with us that they've had several concerns of drought and flood risks over the years, and drought has been kind of a more recent thing in the region. They've experienced changes in rainfall patterns as well relative to historical conditions, and that's led to more intense rain events. And so flooding is also a major concern, not only from tropical storms and hurricanes, but more intense events. And so as a result, among other things, floods was also pretty high risk to the operation. So we're pulling back a little bit the curtain on who the Porch Band of Creek Indians Utility Authority is. We wanted to share with you this high-level look, but we're going to dig into how they used CREAT, the choices they made, and the purpose of it really is not so that you copy what the Porch Band of Creek Indians Utility Authority did, but to give you an idea of how you could use CREAT, because we will be launching a number of poll questions that are all about you. What do you want to do for your assessment? What do you want to choose? What are you interested in looking at? What are threats for your community, your utility? And we're super grateful to Sean Livermore. He's the utilities operations manager for working with us. Sean actually presented on the Porch Band during that introductory session webinar that we mentioned that was held about 3 weeks ago. So it's yet another reason to watch the recording of that webinar. He did a great job. And so we're thankful to Sean and his team for helping us and really agreeing to be a guinea pig on all this and kind of showing to the world what they're up to and how they've used CREAT. So again, bottom line is we want to encourage you guys to do the same as the Porch Band and use CREAT, complete your own assessment, and we'll help you get there. So with that, we're actually going to go ahead and switch over to Mary Jo. She's going to become the driver for the CREAT program, which we now want to show you guys now that we've set everything up. So Mary Jo, I'm making you the presenter. And okay, so what we're going to do is no one needs to log in. We're going to take care of CREAT and demo it for you, so you can kind of, we'll be the drivers, if you will. And the very first thing you're going to see is when you go to the CREAT page, which is create.epa.gov, is this system requires that you have what's called a CREAT account. And the reason is because you're going to be able to create your own assessments that are going to be password protected. No one else can see those. It's going to be available only to you. So when you go to create.epa.gov, you'll click log in, or you're an existing user, and you'll get to this page that you see here on the screen, and it's going to ask you to input your user ID and your password. This was part of your homework assignment for everyone to kind of apply for a CREAT account. So Mary Jo is going to enter her information, and when she does that, that's going to take us to the CREAT, what's called the Get Started page, which you can see here on the screen. And this is the landing page. This is where you begin every time when you get into CREAT. So again, when you log in, you're going to get to this page. And the main thing here, we just wanted to point out a couple things. At the top, there's Get Started, which we'll click on in a sec. There's Resources, which is where there's a bunch of different helpful things. And then there's the Help button, where there's the methodology guide, how to get help. You can watch videos and contact us via email. So there's many ways to reach out to us. Please take full advantage of it. And in the bottom right corner, there is a video. It's called the welcome video. We're not going to watch it today, but that was part of the homework for everybody that's joined us to watch that already. If you haven't, you'll have an opportunity to do that after today's webinar. We're not going to watch it in the interest of time, but it does a really good job of explaining what CREAT is. So we're going to go ahead and click Get Started, and that brings us to a screen that says Get Started at the top, and there's 3 buttons. There's circles in blue that you can click on. There's Build New Assessment, which is what we're going to do. Below that, there's a little helpful feature, a little eye in a circle, and you can click on that little helpful tip to learn more about what this is. And Mary Jo's demonstrating what Build New Assessment is if you're unsure. There's Import Existing Assessment, that's the middle button. And that's going to be part of your homework assignment after today's webinar. And then on the right, rebuild existing assessment. We're going to get into that in session 4 later on. But for the purposes of today, we're going to end up doing build a new assessment. But before we go there, I want to point out one last thing. There's an existing assessment list. So this is, imagine a big tray, and this happens to be chocked full because Mary Jo, as she mentioned, she's in charge of the programming team and has a lot of files. We've worked with a lot of utilities all across the country, big, small, large, and so she's got a lot in there. When you, as a new user, first come in, there will be nothing in there, but we encourage you to build as many assessments as you want. You can always go back and change them, resume, export, and we'll explain all that stuff as we go on. But in the interest of time, we're going to click Build New Assessment. We're starting from scratch, and you have to enter an assessment name. It can be simple, it can be short, it can be sweet. We're going to go ahead and, as we mentioned, focus on the Porch Band of Creek Indians Utility Authority, and Mary Jo's going to type that out and put it in there. You can put whatever name you want for your own assessment. And once she does that, then you'll see that there's 2 choices here for assessment type. You can either do what's called the streamlined or an advanced. And the streamlined basically reduces the number of decisions you need to make by providing more choice. It basically makes decisions for you, and it's a bit more simplified. It might be good for maybe a smaller utility, or if you want to go through this really quickly, but we're going to do an advanced because that gives you the most choices to make. It gives you the most control. You can see all the capabilities, and we think it's not that it's a good way to go, especially as a beginner, and we're going to make that case as we go along. So we've set it to advanced. We're going to click Save. And that's going to take us to the very first page for our new assessment. It's called the Analysis Progress page. Every time you get into your assessment, whether you're the Porch Band of Creek Indians or a utility in another state, you're going to have your assessment name as we typed in, then you've got the status and it says in progress. And if you look to the right, there's a wheel that says 0% complete. That wheel will start to turn green as we complete it. It's 0 because we're just starting. Below that wheel, there's the 5 modules from left to right, and those same modules are on the left side of the screen in that left side menu. So it's a duplicate kind of feature here. And what you do to begin is just click that blue button at the bottom of the page that says continue with climate awareness. So we're now in the very first module, and we're going to start entering information about the utility, because that information later on is going to provide climate and economic data that's going to support our analysis. That's going to help us figure out what do we want to look at, what are our concerns, what do we think might happen in the future that'll impact our operations and our assets. And so Mary Jo is entering on the left side all the location stuff, the name, the address, the city, the state, the zip. We'll talk about this. Most people usually just input their headquarters, their main branch or whatever on the left side, but you may or may not want to look at that location for your assessment, and we'll talk about that. On the right side is everything that's going to help generate our economic data that, again, is working behind the scenes. CREAT will provide for us as a default. You don't need to accept it, but it's going to generate it for us as a good starting point. And there's ownership, financial condition, population served, what system type are you, and then million gallons per day. All those little elements are going to feed into that economic data, as I mentioned. And one other thing I want to point out here, there's a couple helpful features. We already mentioned the little eye in the blue circle. So you can click on that and that'll give you like a helpful tip or an explanation, but there's also a question mark. So next to financial conditions, if you're not sure, am I adequate or good or strong? I have no idea. I'm an operator and I don't deal with money, or I'm not into that topic. Well, you can click on that. That will help you figure out what do you want to use as a starting point. The cool thing about Create is you can always go back and make adjustments and changes. Everything else is pretty straightforward. I guess maybe system type, maybe one more to point out here as a helpful feature. You can select between water only, wastewater only, if you only do those things, or combined wastewater, combined water. The difference between combined wastewater or combined water is that you do one of those things more than the other one. That's really the only difference. And hopefully that captures the majority of people that are doing assessments. So it's not going to be perfect, but it should be pretty good to get people started. So in the interest of time, we're going to hit continue. Again, if we're moving fast, please submit a questions in that questions panel. The very next page is what's called climate basics or climate change basics. And this is just really meant to give you an idea of the different climate regions in the country and what might be relevant to you. So we're going to click on the Southeast region. In the interest of time, when we do that, we get this really nice brief on the Southeast region. So it gives us bullets on observed and projected changes. And then in the middle here is a really sweet table that shows challenges by group in the Southeast. So if you trace it over to the right, you've got a column for drinking water, column for wastewater. And then for each of these topics, you have the little droplets of water where it's going to either be particularly relevant or somewhat. And this covers all sorts of stuff: floods, ecosystem, service demands, drought, that sort of thing. So it gives you a taste of what could happen, what the projections are. And then below that are just some other topics relevant to the Southeast region: trends in water availability, for example, or projected changes in annual precipitation through 2060. Each region obviously is going to have a different result here, and all this information is generated from those national climate assessments. And this is just meant to be a simple brief to help you decide, okay, if you're not sure what what to look at, there's so much to potentially choose from. You can look at this brief and get a good idea as a starting point. Below the map, there's also topics by sector. So let's say you want to get into coasts or water or transportation or extreme weather energy. You can click on any of these links here. It'll open up in a new window or new tab. There's plenty of information for those that want to learn more, and we encourage you to check it out. We're not going to do that on the interest of today's webinar, but it's there if you want to take a look at it. I think it's part of your homework too, to look at the climate region. So we're going to hit continue. That's going to take us to what's called current concerns. And basically, when Mary Jo mouses over this question mark, here's that other helpful feature. Current concerns are factors that are important to consider for you when you're designing infrastructure, conducting your operations, managing your water resources. And the idea here really is, what is something that's important to you currently or historically? Have you been through certain types of disasters or challenges that you want to take note of? And the purpose of this screen is to take note of everything that you're concerned about, basically. So from the left, starting with these little icons, there's a little eye marker, a helpful feature that explains what the marker is. So the first one is water supply management. So that includes things like drought, seasonal demand, low stream flow conditions. And that is a concern of the porch band, so we're going to select that one. Then there's peak service challenges. That's stormwater runoff, seasonal demand. Next to that is water quality management. That's runoff treatment, treatment violations, algal blooms, saltwater intrusion. Next to that is natural disasters: fire, floods, tornadoes, and ice storms. We know the porch band is interested in floods, so we're going to select that one. Then there's ecosystem landscape management, which is like wetland loss, coastal erosion. Below that, in the second row, there's population and demographic changes, land use, customer base, that sort of thing. Then there's sector water service needs. That's looking at the other sectors: energy, health services, local industry. To the right of that is interdependent sector reliability. People choose that one, for example, if they've got power issues or transportation, chemical suppliers. And then finally, sea level rise, and that could include not only saltwater intrusion, but coastal storm surge. So the point of this screen would be for you to choose select all the concerns that you have. You can also add a custom concern. There's a green button at the top. If you want to add something that's not featured here, the cool thing about CREAT is that you've got that capability to do that. And it's a good way to just list out all the different concerns. We're going to focus eventually on a single threat, but we're not quite there yet. So Mary Jo's going to hit continue, and that gets us to the last page of this module. Each of the modules end the same way. Mary Jo hinted at it. There is a summary report. They're interim reports, and the purpose is not just to be a paperwork nightmare, but the purpose is really for you to share what you're doing with other folks that don't have a CREAT account that might be part of your team, or your decision makers, your boss's boss's boss, your key stakeholders, your board members, whatever. You can print these things out, generate them, print them out, and share them with the folks that you might need in order to continue the process and work through this assessment. Because a lot of times we found you can't do it on your own. It's admirable, but it's best to have other people to help you out. So with this summary report, this one happens to be a really awesome one-pager that talks about what are the potential future climate conditions for our target utility, and that's strictly based on that location data that we entered. And the idea here is this one pager is designed to help get buy-in from other stakeholders and other folks, and it shows you what it might look like, the climate out to 2060, which sometimes we refer to that as a worst case kind of thing where there's a lot of uncertainty, but the impacts could be the greatest. So the first band there, it says, what if the climate were significantly hotter? And it shows on the right that there'd be a 5.13 Fahrenheit degree increase in average annual temperature, and over 24 days over 100 degrees by 2060. And then it does the same thing for if the climate were significantly wetter, where there's a 12.9% change in annual precipitation, that's more, and then a 26.94 increase in your 100-year storm events. Those are those intense precipitation events. That's a significant increase. And then below that, finally, what if it were drier? And that's a minus 3.7% change in annual precipitation. So the idea here is it gives you some ideas of maybe you're not sure where to start, and you look at these three options and say, you know what, the drier one, wow, that's really significant. I want to look at just that. Or you might think that's not a big deal, but hey, the wetter, significantly wetter situation, that is a big deal because floods are a big concern. So that's really, this is really meant to help you, guide you, figure out where do you want to start, but then also, as we mentioned, share it with those stakeholders and other people, important folks that you want to get on your team to continue this assessment process, because it does take time to continue it. So that is it for module one. I'm going to go ahead and reclaim control from Mary Jo. And we know we went through that like really quickly. So as I mentioned, please enter any questions you have in that questions panel. But one thing we wanted to do was sort of recap what we've done with the Porch Band of Creek Indians Utility Authority, because we've been showing you how CREAT works, but we're also entering in information for the Porch Band. So we want to make sure that you guys follow along. We haven't lost you, but this also leads us to ask a couple of questions of you guys. And I will get to that in a second here. But so we entered in, you know, what type of utility is the Porch Band of Creek Indians Utility Authority? It's privately owned, it's good financial conditions, 6,400 population served, combined wastewater utility. That's the type that they selected. Remember, there was 4 choices there, and then they treat about 2.1 million gallons per day on average. So question to everyone on the phone, this isn't gonna come in the form of a poll question, but we want you to write down, if you're a pen and paper type of person, or if you've got a cell phone or your smartphone, be ready to type it in. We want you to, this is our first question to you, thinking about your own assessment, what system type would you choose as part of your assessment? Would you be water only, wastewater only, combined water, or combined wastewater? So take a few minutes to write that down. Again, what system type would you choose? And then second, for the Porch Band, they selected floods and droughts, which should also be listed here, but we're gonna focus on flood, as you'll see. We're gonna pick one threat, but they selected floods and droughts. So second question to everyone that's joining us today, what are your current concerns? Write them down on scrap piece of paper, in your smartphone, you know, what were or are extreme events that impact your infrastructure and operations, your community, your ability to provide clean drinking water or safe wastewater services. What are you dealing with? And that could be water supply management, natural disasters, ecosystem changes, population changes, interdependent sector reliability. It's really going to be up to you. This is not about Porch Fan. This is about you and what you want to put in your own assessment. So take a moment to do that. Our next step is to figure out how will the current concerns change in the future, and that's going to be module 2. So if flood is our current concern, we've been dealing with it historically, how do we think that might change in the future? Is it going to be worse? Is it going to stay the same? We're going to be able to design scenarios to look at that. Okay, so we're on to create module 2. This is all about scenario development. We're going to be building on what we just entered in module 1. So step 2 in the risk assessment process. And what have we done so far? Just as a quick reminder, we reviewed our climate impact. So that was that map of the country with the different climate regions to figure out, okay, what's coming our way? What are some projections? What are some things that might key me into some changes that I want to look at. And then we also identified our current concerns. Those are things that, historically you've been through, you're going through now that are of concern to you and that might be something that you want to look at. How could that change in the future? So that's what it's all about of what we've entered so far. So this new module, module 2, scenario development, it's going to prompt you to think critically about the challenges your utility may face under future climate conditions and allows you to build scenarios to use in your assessments. So your climate assessments, and what are scenarios? Those are different changes in climate conditions that may present different threats to your operations, your infrastructure, the way you do business, if you're an owner operator, but if you're a technical provider, technical service provider, or state agency, think about what changes might occur and impact the utilities in your community, in your state, and the areas that you serve. And scenarios typically include 2 parts that we're going to dig into: historical climate data. So this is things that have been measured and tracked over 20-year time periods. It's done, it's in the books. And then also future climate change conditions. These are things that have not happened, projected with some uncertainty, but different ways that you can look at what might happen in the future, and things that you might be interested in. So we're going to look at both sides of that equation. And the goal here is on the screen. Really, it's going to be to do 2 things. Select a threat. We're going to ask you guys to narrow down all those current concerns that you may have listed, that shopping cart full of different issues and challenges. We're going to ask you to narrow it down to 1 to begin with, or 2 if you want to do this in the future and do more work, but we'll start it easy. So we'll select a threat, and then we're going to develop scenarios of potential future climate conditions for assessing impacts through time. So as part of your assessment, we're going to ask you guys to focus on 1 scenario that you'll build out of future climate conditions. And really the whole goal here is to help us figure out or anticipate how might a current concern that you identified earlier change in the future. And we'll definitely get into that in a second here. So I asked it, earlier, what is a scenario? And in CREAT, scenarios are projected changes in climate with respect to several different items. There's average conditions, and that includes things like temperature and precipitation, as well as surface water flows. There's extreme events, so that's things like number of hot days that you deal with, or intense storm precipitation events. And then there's also sea level rise, if that's relevant to you and you want to look at that. And scenarios can represent potential climate conditions based on historical records, like we mentioned earlier, climate models, or maybe even other data. For example, one of the cool things about CREAT is you can enter in custom data. So if you're already working with your state climatologist or your primacy agency, your DEQ has got something going on climate and they've collected data, or there's a university, an extension program nearby, you can fold that data into what you want to look at. So CREAT's very flexible, and we'll show you how that works, but there's definitely different elements here that you can pull in if you like. The first thing we're going to do is look at baseline scenarios. That's at the bottom of the screen here. This is that historical climate conditions for a given location. So you remember in module 1, we typed in the location of the porch band of Creek Indians Utility Authority. That is going to be where we're going to get climate data. It's going to look at that location behind the scenes, under the hood, and pull in historical climate conditions for that location. And you basically create this, what's called a baseline scenario, in order to compare how the current threats might change in the future. For example, with the average conditions, would there be more temperature, more bigger increases in temperature, precipitation changes? So we've seen, for example, utilities and communities consider several different things when selecting, what am I going to look at kind of question in their mind. And so they're selecting specific temperatures and precipitation data to look at, and we'll show you how that works when we get into CREAT. But they might ask themselves, for example, are there certain months where temperatures are particularly important for understanding future climate change impacts? For example, let's say there's changes in summer temperature. Will that be important for me to understand what my future water demand might be? Or they might want to look at winter temperatures and think to themselves, okay, we're currently getting a lot of snow. If it gets warmer, would the precipitation change to rain? And would that impact how we do business, our operations? Maybe, maybe not. Finally, some folks have looked at spring and they think, okay, that's a big spring temperatures, the impact on the timing of snow melt if you're in one of those states that relies on snow melt. So there's definitely different ways to address it on the temperature front. Same with precipitation, for example. Folks ask themselves, if there's changes in precipitation during certain months, is that going to be important for example, my water supply planning or my flooding risk? And so that's one of the reasons, as you guys will see under baseline scenario, we're going to construct it and look at specific elements of a year, temperature, precipitation, surface water, what have you, to understand better what the impacts could be in the future. And that's where we get into what's called projected scenarios, as you can see here on the screen. And in CREAT, we're going to define projected scenarios so that we can look at a range of potential conditions. And you're going to be able to select among several. We're going to ask you guys to, beginning with your assessment, select just one, but there's many things you could look at that we've already kind of seen at the end of module 1. So the first one with the red circle and the thermometers, how would threats change in the future if it was hotter and drier? Or in the middle with the blue circle, if the future was warmer and wetter than it is now, what does that mean for you? And then at the bottom, what if it's just moderate changes? What if things, don't change very much either way, whether hot or dry or warm or wetter, it's kind of more in the middle. There's another option too, where you can look at just historical uh, scenario where like the history is going to continue in the future. There's going to be very little or no changes, and you can look at that too, which is kind of interesting. Usually selecting, what you want here, selecting the data, defining your threat. What do I want to look at? It's a challenging step where you really got to put your thinking cap on, and that's where those resources in module 1 might be able to help you, like the climate maps, and show you what the impacts might be. Or this is where, as Mary Jo mentioned, you might want to talk to other people, other utilities, other, state level agency folks, or whoever it might be, other resources that could help you, at least get started and maybe suggest where to look or what to look at, different types of scenarios. So that's if you don't have any ideas of where to start, but hopefully we help you get motivated and show you good ways, good starting points. So on this next screen, this basically gets into the CREAT provided projected scenarios, because you might be wondering, where do these things come from? We're not going to look under the hood, as I mentioned. We're just going to kind of show you guys what's available at the top level, but we do want to explain a couple things. So as we've already seen, CREAT provides several projected scenarios for you to consider for your own assessment. And this diagram shows where those scenarios kind of come from. So if you work with me, at the bottom of the graph, the x-axis, that's projected changes in temperature by 2060. So from left to right, it gets hotter. And then on the left side of the graph, the y-axis, that's projected changes in precipitation by 2060. So from bottom to top, it's going to get wetter. And then in between, there's all these little black boxes. If you look in the bottom left corner, it says there's individual climate models. And basically the way CREAT is set up, that for each location of the United States, imagine there's a gigantic grid is laid over the country. And within each one of those cells, 38 different climate models are run for that particular location. And so these circles, which I'll explain in a second, kind of are the results of those 38 climate models being run. And this data, these models come from what's called the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. IPCC stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The most recent one was 2014, that's built into CREAT. And using those 38 models, there's the total of 38 models for each grid cell, we get these different results. And each grid cell, for those that want to know, each grid cell is quite large. It's half-degree resolution for latitude and longitude. And you'll see that when we get into CREAT, but they're quite big. And so within each of those grid cells, those 38 models are run. And so what that results in is we selected and averaged 5 modules that projected the hottest and driest conditions. So that's going to be the bottom right circle, which to me kind of looks pink or salmon colored, and that's models that project hotter, drier conditions. We did the same thing for those that projected wetter but not as hot conditions. You can call that warm. So that's going to be the upper left. It's the light blue circle. Those are the 5 models that project wetter and warmer conditions. And then we also looked at the climate models that fall in the middle of these 38 models of this big scatter plot. And that is what looks like a purple or gray circle. And those are models that project moderate conditions, so sort of in between the warmer, wetter, the hotter, drier. And depending on your concerns, this comes back to you, you would select the most appropriate scenario. So for example, users concerned with drought most often would select hotter, drier projections, or users concerned with floods would look at the wetter projections because that's going to be more important to them. That said, we're going to ask that you guys only pick one to begin with, as we'll show you, but you can go back and run different models. You can do different things over time, so you've got that capability. Couple of notes about this graph here. These projections are an average of 5 models. There's no guarantee that any one climate model is going to be correct. So we advocate, as I mentioned earlier, that you use kind of a range of potential conditions and evaluate your resilience against the range. So you could redo your assessment or do multiple assessments with hotter, drier, warmer, wetter, moderate, historical. It's really going to be up to you. As I mentioned earlier, in reality, most new users, usually handling just one baseline scenario, one projected, is kind of the easiest way to start. A lot of people tend to look at what's called the worst case scenario. It might be like, out to 2060, the hotter, drier, if they're looking at drought, for example. And that's really just the first way to do it. As I mentioned several times, you can always return, go back and redo it later on and add more additional refinements and details. So you're not locked in. You can do as many assessments as you like. There are some additional scenarios in CREAT that we do want to point out that are available to you if you want to use them. One on the left side of the screen here is what's called intense precipitation. So this is exactly what you probably think it is, precipitation events, those stormy types of things. And so you've got 3 choices. There's historical storms. So this is like extreme precipitation events. They're based on observed total precipitation that occurs on average between or within a 24-hour period and a 72-hour period. So it's exactly like what history has shown you. It's going to continue in the future. But if you want to look at a change, you can do not a stormy future. So that's going to be the average of 5 models that projected the lowest increase in total precipitation for a particular event, which would indicate kind of like smaller increase in storm intensity. Or if you want to look at a stormy future, a more intense future, that's going to be the average of 5 individual models. So that's another thing that you can pull in. On the right side, you've got what's called surface water. So if that's a big concern to you, for example, for flooding or water supply management, you can look at historical surface water. So this is based on observed measurements. There's no change in future conditions. but let's say lower future flows is a big issue for you. If surface water is your main source, based on the models with the lowest projections of stream flow relative to historical conditions, you would select lower future flows. The opposite of that would be higher future flows, where the models with the highest projections of stream flow relative to historical conditions would give you kind of these higher flows. So you're going to have those options. We're going to show you what the porch band selected, but again, it's going to really be up to you. And one of the last elements of scenarios that you can incorporate is what's called coasts. And this involves that sea level rise impacts and concerns. So you've got low rate of sea level rise that's based on a projection of a 0.5 meter sea level rise relative to today. You've got a moderate rate, so that's based on a projection of 1 meter sea level rise relative to today, and then a high rate that's 2 meter sea level rise relative to today. There's also another option, it's historical, where let's say you don't think there's going to be a change and you want to kind of see what it looks like if it continues to be the same relative to today. So you've got this additional projected scenario element to consider when you're building your own projected scenario. And we'll definitely, again, show you how this all works in CREAT, but we want to introduce it now while we've got an opportunity to do that. There are a couple other steps in Module 2 that we do want to point out to your, or bring to your attention before we jump into the CREAT demo. One's called threat definition. And so basically, this is a pretty important step here in CREAT, so we do want to spend a little bit of time on it, but you will be defining your threat, the threat to your operations, your community, et cetera, in order to capture the impacts of future climate conditions. So you'll consider, this is definitely a thought exercise, put your thinking caps on. You'll consider how the past events, for example, could change. So maybe they could occur more frequently, or they could result in increased damage or challenges to your assets and operations. Because this hasn't happened, this is all projected, you'll have to put your thinking cap on, as we mentioned. So there's some examples here in the middle of the screen. So if you're interested in drought, that's your current concern, and you select it as your threat, there might be some changes based on the projections to the duration of the drought, or annual and seasonal rainfall. That might change, which would impact your supply. There might be a change to reservoir levels or stream flow, for example. Same with the flood. There might be changes to flooded, damaged equipment. It could be maybe worse than it was historically. There could be changes in river levels. Again, you'll have to think through, based on what I'm seeing in the projected scenario, these are the actual impacts I think could happen to my systems, my operations, the way I do business. Wildfires, the last one featured here, maybe the area burned gets bigger, the duration of impacts to water supply gets longer. It's definitely an important step. It's a difficult one because you have to use all that information you learned when you were building your projected climate data, your scenarios, and you got to consider, how would those changes work or unfold? How could they? What would that mean for the threat? What would that mean for my utility and my community? So for example, if somebody picked a stormy scenario and they picked the 100-year storm and it's expected to be 20% stronger, well, what does that actually mean? That could be increased amounts of rainfall. And for example, if you had a close call with previous floods due to flash flooding, and there was maybe no damage previously, but now it's 20% more rain, what does that mean for your utility? Can you frame the magnitude of this future threat with respect to past events? So the past will look different. It could get worse in certain ways. There's always going to be uncertainty, but that's where that thought exercise comes into play. And we'll give you guys some examples of that when we dive into CREAT. So again, I know we're moving quick. If you have any questions, please submit them in the questions panel. We will have time to get to them, we promise. That's the best way to reach out to us for now. So what we're gonna do next is actually jump into CREAT. Now that we've laid everything out there, we wanna show you guys what it looks like in CREAT. Same as before, you don't need to log in. We will be doing that for you. I'm gonna go ahead and change over to Mary Jo so that she can do the driving, and we can walk you guys through CREAT. So Very first thing that you see in the middle of the screen, this is not an error or mistake on our part. We left it up on purpose. It's a timeout warning due to inactivity. So Create will log you out. Remember, you've got your own login credentials. When you log in, the clock starts ticking down. And if you don't do anything, if you're not clicking screens, you'll get logged out. That's important. If you're in the middle of something, building a scenario, writing a paragraph, and you got to take a break or talk to somebody to verify it, make sure you hit next or save, or we'll show you what to do. But if you get this message, it's really simple. You just log back in. You'll get to this get started page again. And remember that tray of assessments down here at the bottom. Mary Jo's going to hit resume for the one we were just working on, and it brings us to the analysis progress screen. We've completed 19.2% of our analysis, our create assessment. So great job, everyone. We're getting closer and making headway. So we're going to click continue scenario development and get into these different pages. We're going to move quick. So again, if you have any questions, please submit those in the questions panel. The very first screen, it's called Scenario Primer, and it's basically, there's nothing to enter here, but it's an orientation to understanding and developing climate scenarios, kind of what we already went over in the slides, but there is a really great video. This is part of your homework that you'll have to do after today's webinar. It's really good. It's much more charming and eloquent than I am, so we recommend you take a look if we missed you or you were confused on what we went through in the slides. Really nice video. We're going to hit continue because there's again nothing to enter in. And that takes us to our second part of step 2, that's threat identification. There is that question mark again with the bolded word for threat. Mary Jo's going to mouse over that. So the default threats in CREAT are derived from a combination of changes in climate conditions that result in impacts to assets. So what that means basically is that all that information we entered in module 1 is now going to come back, and there's 5 threats featured in CREAT. And from left to right, I'll just quickly describe those. There's drought, which is pretty straightforward, but that's changing water levels in aquifers and reservoirs, loss of snowpack, and reductions in surface water flows. There's the eye below each one of these icons. You can click on it to learn more about it. Ecosystem changes is the next one. That's altered status, structure, or functionality of an ecosystem, such as loss of coastal systems, increases in wildfires, altered vegetation. Floods, we all kind of know what that is. It's high flow events from intense precipitation, but there's also coastal surges, and that could be in combination with sea level rise, which could be a real threat to somebody along the coast. The last 2 are service demand and use. So this is altered volume and temperature of influent or challenges in meeting the needs of agriculture, energy sectors, the other groups that you support. Finally, water quality degradation, the saline intrusion into aquifers, contamination, or negatively altered surface water quality. So here, you would select one threat for part of your scenario. You can select as many as you want, but the more you select, it gets more complicated. And that's why we suggested as part of your homework, you select one. And we're going to do the exact same thing with our friends from the Porch Band Creek of Indians Utility Authority. We're going to select just floods, even though they also identified drought. For the purpose of the training, we're just going to go with floods, and we're going to move forward with that and start to define how will that change in the future. And the very first thing we're going to do is take us to our baseline scenario. So right up at the top, you'll see what's called a tutorial or a tutorial carousel. This is actually part of your homework to flip through this. This actually is going to be a recap of what we talked about on the slides and what we're about to do. But as Mary Jo is sort of mousing through the tutorial, it just sort of flips these different pages. Really, really handy information to help you understand what you're about to do. We're going to end up hiding it so that we have more screen real estate, but it's part of your homework so you can learn more about it. There's also a reference to what's called the CREAT methodology guide, which is for those real nuts and bolts types amongst us. And if you want to open the hood and understand how all this stuff works, it's a long, lengthy document with all the sources and data categories and where all this information comes from that looks so nicely formatted on the screen. We're not going to be able to get into it, but we recommend it if you want to take a look. So the very first thing we're going to do for the Porch Band of Creek Indians Utility Authority is build a baseline scenario. Mary Jo moused over that definition. So this is built on the data that's well accepted for use in decision planning or conducting other assessment. In CREAT, the baseline scenario is used for comparison purposes to other developed scenarios. So this is going to help us compare. We need to know what the baseline is and how it's going to change. It's going to come back to help us when we get to Module 5. So one of the cool things about CREAT is by default, it includes these slider things. And remember, we went through all the different elements of scenarios like temperature, precip, surface water, coast. We're going to get into each one. By default, CREAT believes or thinks that you're going to want to include temperature and precipitation. So the slider in the middle is set to include. You could always exclude it. You can do whatever you want. There's a lot of flexibility, but for the purposes of the Porch Band, we're going to look at temperature. So we're going to dive into first temperature. We got to set our location on the earth, where our data is going to come from, and then we're going to set the measurements. So we're going to do that for each of our elements of our scenario. So remember, we talked about that gigantic grid that's laid over the nation, and this is what it kind of looks like at the very local level. So when we entered in that location information for Atmore, Alabama, for the utility authority, it picked this grid in green. It's got the hash marks in the green color, but we can select a different grid if we want to. This worked out really well. Sean and his team said keep that grid, but let's say, for example, you put in your headquarters building, but where you want to look at is a well field that's part of your system that's 10 miles away. Or let's say you want to look at a reservoir that's at 9,000 feet, that's 50 miles away, and that's where the snowpack feeds into that reservoir. You might decide, I want to change where the grid is so that the data that I'm going to look for or I'm going to get for temperature is in a different part of my system. So that decision is going to be up to you. For this example, given the smaller size, I guess, like the system fits into this grid, but we will make some changes to some locations and we'll show you that as we go on. But we're going to keep this default selected temperature grid. Now we're going to select our temperature station. This is going to be the location where our extreme heat data comes from. So this is days over 90, 95, and 100 degrees. That's going to be useful for us to build our scenario. So we need to determine by picking one of these diamonds, where do we want to get the data from? And by default, the Atmore temperature station is selected. Again, you can select whatever you want. If you want it to be to the north, to the south, to the west, whatever, it's going to be up to you based on your goals, right? But we want this particular location. Sean and his team said, keep it at Atmore. That's the right temperature station for us. As you can see, there's much to choose from, and it's really going to be up to you. So we will save that. We've just set our location. Now we want to select what measurements do we want to look at. And there is a lot. By default, CREAT figures you want to include annual temperature. So that's just all 12 months. It's just annualized annual temperature. But let's say you want to look at monthly temperatures, because remember we were talking about earlier, are there temperatures that are more important to you than other ones? That'll help you define something. So we are going to select the summer months of temperature to see what those impacts might be on our flood scenario. And that's what Sean and his team decided to include. So we've selected those months. You can decide on other months, for example, spring months, winter months, fall months, whatever it's going to be, that's going to be up to you. This is what the Porch Band decided to select. And then finally below is the number of hot days. This could be completely irrelevant to you. You may not care at all, but the Porch Band wanted to include it. So this is the number of days over 90, 95, and 100 annually. So if you think that that's going to be an issue for you, that might be a measurement you want to keep track of. So we're just at this point selecting all the temperature stuff we want to look at from a historical point of view so we can compare it to the future. We're going to do the same thing for precipitation. We're going to first select our location. Obviously, there's a lot of places you can select from, and I think we're going to have to go all the way over. I wish we were in the Caribbean as much as I really like Alabama, but we're going to go to our precipitation grid cell, and same deal. You can select a different cell if that's important to you. For example, you want to look at a precipitation point closer to your reservoir or closer to the snowpack or whatever it might be. For this particular case, because we're looking at flooding, we want to look at the local location. So we're going to keep the default precipitation grid, that's the green cell. Now we also have to set a precipitation station. This one's kind of interesting because we've got, again, a lot of choices, but we end up keeping the default selection at Atmore because we want to just look at what locally is going to happen close to some of our treatment facilities. So we have now selected our location, same deal as with temperature. We got to figure out what measurements do we want. So we're going to keep total annual precipitation because that's important to us. And now here's where it gets interesting. We want to select monthly precipitation values. Again, this is historical. And so Sean and his team said, we want to look at 2 time periods, a wet spring, that's March, April, May, and a wet fall, which also kind of coincides with tropical storm hurricane season. So as you notice, we're not picking all the months, we're not picking other months. We're just picking the months that we think are going to be important for the porch band and their concerns. You're going to have to do the same kind of thought process. And then below that is that intense event. And this is where that intense storm event comes into play. There's lots of choices here. We're going to go with the default selections of the 100-year intense precipitation event. There's 2 options, number of inches in 24 hours and number of inches in 72 hours. So those tend to be the chosen ones for flood, and we're going to stick with those again because our main threat is flood. We want to look at the flood threat and how it might change in the future. By default, surface water's not included, but Sean and his team wanted to include it. Same deal, we're going to set our location. As you can tell, this is an involved process. There's a lot of things to consider, but we're hoping to make it easy for you, and we will have some poll questions that'll help guide you in your selection. So this one's really interesting. This is one of the newer features of CREAT. This is where you can select a different stream flow gauge to show you all the historical data. I think it's in a 20-year chunk. If you want to look at it. And so by default, this is an interesting one. We're going to make a change here. By default, we got the Brushy Creek near Bratt, Florida, but we don't want that. We want one to the north because that is along the big Escambia Creek at the Sardine Branch near Stanley Crossroad. That water is going to flow towards the treatment plant, the lift stations, the wastewater operations. So we want to know what's going on up there to the north of the plant and the operation. So that's what Sean and his team wanted, and we selected it. You will have to do the same thing if you want to do that for your assessment. This next one is where the projected flow would come from. This is the data for the projected flow. As you can see, tons and tons of diamonds here. We're going to end up selecting the big Escambia Creek. That's going to be our projected flow for the future. That's going to be the location that we wanted, again, mostly upstream of the plant itself and the lift stations and the service area. We're going to hit save. That's going to lock in our location. Now we need to do the measurements, and there are many if you want. And I'll just quickly define a few of them. So there is mean flow up at the top. That is the average daily stream flow. There's minimum flow. That's the average annual low daily flow. There's the max flow. That's the average annual high daily flow. Then 7Q10, that's the 10-year low stream flow. So that's a 7-day low flow, which is a 10% probability of occurring in a given year. And there's the 7Q2, that's the 2-year low stream flow. So lots of choices here. Sean and his team only wanted 2, minimum flow, max flow. We're going to keep it simple. When you do this, you're going to have to set your own measurements, and we hope to help you get there and decide what to select. We do want to show you guys the coast data. It's not included by default. We want to show it to you. It ends up not being part of what Sean wanted to even look at and his team, but we do want to show you because we've probably got some coastal utility. So you would select a tide gauge, and this is the location where that coastal data on the sea level rise and the number of days of flooding from the coast would come into play. The closest one in Alabama is the Dauphin Island. We're just going to select it to show you guys what it looks like, but we're not going to use it as part of the assessment. So Mary Jo set the location, and then you get to select the measurements, and there's vertical land movement. So this is how much the land is either sinking or rising. There's sea level rise, which is, the rise, overall rise. So that, remember we talked about there's historical, low rate, moderate rate, high rate, and then number of days with tidal flooding in days. So there's some factors that you might want to look at if that's important to you. If we save, because we've decided not to include it and there is no um, you know, coastal gauge that we've set, it automatically switches over to exclude. But if you wanted to do it, you could include it. Final thing we want to point out, there's custom. So if you want to do some cool measurement that we haven't even heard about, that you are doing in your locality, your state, your climate scientists, your extension services, the folks in your state are doing cool stuff, you could include that here. The interesting part though, or something to maybe not caution, but if you enter historical data, you're also going to need the projected data as well. So CREAT would not provide you with your own custom data. Like, you would need to enter all that in there. But what CREAT provides, is we're going to show you, is all the baseline historical data and projected data for the elements that are incorporated into CREAT. So we've made our selections. We're going to go ahead and just click next. That's the view edit selections. And this is our baseline scenario. This is our historical data. This is what we've created, and we're going to show you what's in here. This is specific to the porch band and Sean's team. So under temperature, we've got the annual average temperature, that's 65.17 degrees Fahrenheit. Then we've got our monthly temperatures, June, July, August, September. And then we've got our number of hot days. There's quite a number. Number of hot days over 90 is 70, 95, 16. Number of days over 100 is 1. And this is based on historical average, I think in 20-year chunks. To the left of this table here, you see source. This tells you where the data is coming from. So currently it's set to CREAT. But if you had custom data, let's say you're working with somebody really smart in your state and they're like, man, that average, it's a little off. We think it should be 2 degrees higher. You can enter that in right here. Again, you would need the projected data too, but you can enter in custom data. So there's a lot of flexibility in CREAT. So this is just the temperature. We want to show you guys what the precipitation looks like. And that's total annual, so it's 63 inches on average fall in this part of the world, in this cell. And then we've got March, April, May, that's our wet spring, and then September, October, November, that's our wet fall. And then we've got our precipitation events, and that's an important one. So what this is saying for the intense precipitation events is, in a 24-hour period, 10 inches could fall, up to 10 inches. In 72 hours, that's 14 inches. So that could be significant, especially if it increases if you select a stormier future. Next, we got surface water. So these are those two areas we selected. It's average annual minimum flow, average annual maximum. So this gives us in cubic feet per second. Again, this could be a big deal if you were involved with some near miss flooding, for example, and now you think it's going to get worse in the future. That could be big, and that could lead to some serious impacts. So that's what we selected. As you notice, coast data and custom, it's blanked out. There's nothing there. So we're going to hit continue in the interest of time. We just built out what our baseline scenario is. Now we need to select what's called the time period. So Mary Jo, if you could mouse over time period, that definition. So this is the range of years that you want to consider for your analysis based on your own planning horizons, your water resource management, your improvement schedules, your own climate action plans. And what we're going to do is set a date, and that's going to pull from two different data sets. One is what's called the 2035 projection, and that's based on model data, climate model data, projected data from 2025 to 2045. So it's a 20-year period out into the near future. The other option is 2060, and that's going to pull model data from 2050 to 2070. You can select either one. The farther you go out, there's more uncertainty. The closer in, less certainty. So it's really going to depend on you. Sean and his team decided to select 2035 because that just worked with their own planning horizon. They wanted to look at a shorter term. For example, it could be the end of a life cycle of a plant, or you're going to replace a bunch of your lift stations in 2035. So you want to know what the rain amounts are going to be, or you're thinking about building a new $1 billion reservoir, and that's going to be in 2060. So you want to know what the future is going to look like. And the idea is picking a time period that aligns with what you're already doing and thinking your capital improvement plans. So we'll hit continue. We've selected 2035. Now gets interesting. There, first off, is the projected scenario. Here's that tutorial for the projected scenario. A lot of this might look familiar because we covered this in the slides. This is part of your homework to look at this on your own time after today's webinar. We're going to hide the tutorial, but it goes into how to build your own projected scenario. In order to do that, we need to add a scenario to our baseline. So by default, it shows our baseline. Now we're going to add in a new scenario. And I think you guys probably know where this is going to go. We're doing a warmer and wetter, more stormy, and higher future flows scenario. So if you haven't guessed it, this is all about flood and maximize that flood risk, flood threat. And this is what Sean and his team wanted to do. And there's kind of a lot to this one. I can just kind of explain it, but basically this is a warmer, wetter, more stormy and higher future flow scenario. It's going to include annual and that June, July, August, September temperatures. It's going to include projected and annual March, April, May, September, October, November precipitation. It's going to also include those 100-year storm events for the more stormy future, as well as the minimum and the maximum surface water flow. So everything, basically we're just cataloging everything we selected earlier in our baseline. Here's what we're going to look at and how it's going to change in the future. So you can add in as much as you want for description, or as little as you want, but it's always good to document so people know if they're following up, like, why did he select that? Or why did she do this? Oh, I see it, it's in the description. First thing we gotta do is select our temperature and average precipitation. So we've got some choices. Historical conditions remains the same, warmer, wetter, just like we saw in that graph. Moderate future conditions, it's in the middle, and then the hotter, drier is the average of the five model. So we're gonna select warmer, wetter, because that's what we wanna look at. When we do that, if you noticed when Mary Jo was clicking on those buttons, it changed the values. So this table's slightly different now. We've got source, measurement, value, and unit. And when you click on the different icons, it's going to change the values. So they could go up. For example, annual temperature goes up if it's hotter, drier. It could go down if it's warmer, wetter. If it's historical, it would stay exactly what it was historically. So that's kind of how it works. It'll give you different ranges for temperature and precip. We got to do the same for our intense precipitation scenario. You get to select if you want to include this or not. Sean and his team wanted stormy future, so we're going to include that, and that gives us a percent increase of the 100-year precipitation event. And this one's big. That's a 13, almost 14% increase. So that could be significant to their operations. So we just selected our intense precip. We're going to do the same for surface water. Remember, we're going to look at min and max. Now we got to decide, do we want higher future flows, lower, or historical? Sean and his team wanted higher, so we're going to do that. Remember, there was no coastal or custom, so there's nothing to enter there. We're going to hit save as we recommended. And here now is the table. This is the new table, the second table that we get. We've got measurement on the left, the value, the units, and what the source is. And this only shows you what either the increase or decrease is going to be. So for example, under temperature for annual change in temp, it's going up by 1.89 degrees Fahrenheit. And then it shows us the monthly values, what they're going up in temperature, and the number of hot days is going up as well. Same with precipitation, it gives us in percentages what the increase is going to be. So annually it's 6%, but take a look at September. That's a 17.79 jump in annual September precipitation data. That could be significant if it's combined with, for example, a tropical storm or something like that, or the 100-year intense precipitation event, because it's also going up by 13.85%. All that could combine to be bad. It's really going to depend on how you see it. And then finally, surface waters, the values go up in terms of the cubic feet. One of the cool things about CREAT is exporting data. So let's say you work with a bunch of people, technically challenged, they don't know how to get into CREAT, you can export this. So if Mary Jo clicks export data, it's going to show us a spreadsheet in Microsoft Excel of all the values we entered. So we've got our baseline scenario, we've got our projected scenario, and then it's also got our map locations as well, like where does the data come from? And that's significant because one thing we've seen with utilities and community partners we worked with is sometimes they'll start an assessment and they're like, you know what? I don't like that base station or whatever. I want a different one that's 50 miles away or that's closer to my well fields or that's at the coast and not inland. And so you might decide, I want to change that. And you can do that. You can go back and you'll probably get different data as a result because it's a different location. But anyway, this is a super handy feature. We encourage you guys to check it out because you can download that and share it with people that don't have a CREAT account, and that can help you make your decisions and refine things. The last thing we got to do in CREAT here is what's called threat definition. And there's a tip box. This is one of those other tips. And basically this is where the thinking game comes into play, where you take all that information that you've built out, your baseline scenario, your time period, your projected, and now you need to define how would that current concern change in the future based on those elements that you've created for yourself. And you have to do that for two ways. One is baseline scenario. So you got to write a very, very short paragraph or sentence or couple of sentences on what is your threat, what does it look like to you, and how might that change in the future. And Mary Jo is grabbing some language we already had typed up. This was part of your homework. And for Sean and his team, floods is a threat. It's a high flow event, meaning it's surface event, right? It's not coastal. And basically what we learned in working from them is they've experienced past floods. Impacts of the operations have been minimal, though. There have been some direct impacts, including access challenges due to the flooding of the road leading to their wastewater treatment plant. There was some elevated flow at their wastewater treatment plant. There was some access to low-lying lift stations, and they actually had some near-miss flooding at those lift stations where they weren't damaged, but it was close. And there were some indirect impacts, including infiltration of manholes. So that's historic. Now, let's say our wetter, warmer, more stormy, higher future flow comes to pass. If we put our thinking caps on, what could those changes be? How could that historical condition now change to maybe become worse or maybe become the same thing? In Sean and his team's view, this was going to become kind of worse for them. So I can just quickly read this. Basically, this is a worst case flooding event with more intense, more frequent extreme precipitation events and higher future flows. Increased precipitation in March, April, and May, and September, November, along with higher future flows along rivers, could cause greater and longer duration flooding that exceeds the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant, which would result in discharges of untreated water, and it would also threaten low-lying areas of the plant. If water gets into the plant, that could lead to a failure of plant equipment. That would not be good. And flooding could also cut off and damage lift stations and backup power generators. This is a thought exercise. The future has not come to pass, but what we're asking you guys to do is thinking about those elements you selected, what could happen so that you can figure it out a little bit and start to help yourself plan for that situation. So we've entered that in. We're going to hit continue so that it saves. That's key. And one of the very last things, just like module one, we've got a scenario development summary. This is those interim reports that you can share with your big boss, your council, whatever, whoever's helping make decisions. You can download this version in this report, your scenario and threats report in Word, and you can share it with them. And it's really cool because it includes everything you've entered, including your baseline scenario, how you defined it, your projected scenario, how you defined it, all the elements that you selected for your baseline and your future, and how they're going to change by what percentage, by what unit. It's all there, really simple, nice formatted tables. Hopefully this reduces the burden on you to do anything because it's already there. It gives you the map locations. And the point again is if you work with folks that aren't on Create, they're technically challenged, they don't know what to do, you can print this out, you can share it with them, you can email it with them, and that way everybody that's on your team, everybody that's helping you can keep track of what you've decided so far. Maybe they'll have a suggestion like take out this month or let's do a different location. That happens, and that's cool. That's the whole point of this, to see what threats do you want to build, what scenarios do you want to build. Most people don't just build one, there's several. So anyway, we wanted to show you guys that report. I know we've gone through this like super fast. I do want to take us back to the slides so that we can show you guys and continue on with the slide presentation, but recognize we've gone through this quickly given the time constraints. I'm sure you've got some questions or comments. Please enter those in the questions panel on the upper right corner of your screen. I promise we'll have time. We'll leave the lines open at the end to get through this with any questions you might have. Okay, so let's do a little recap. We know we threw a lot out at you. Recognize it came fast and furious. So same thing as before. What is the threat we're focusing on for the porch band? It's floods. How could this threat change in the future? Remember what we just saw. There's increased temperature and increased precipitation overall. There's increased temperature in June and September, increased precipitation in March and May. The March through May, that's our spring, and then September, October, that's our wet fall. Weirdly, November went down in precipitation, but overall it's going up. And then a big kicker here is our 100-year storm event. It increases by 14%. That could be very significant, and it is for our utility because that results in higher surface water flows. There's more water coming towards the plant and the lift station. So what does this mean for our utility? Increased precipitation, increase in intense storms, and higher future flows may lead to high flow events impacting our utility infrastructure. And as we saw in that threat definition, that little paragraph we wrote up with Sean's help and his team, the worry is that there's greater and longer duration of flooding. So it's not like before where it went down quick, but it could stick around for longer. It's higher in elevation that could exceed the capacity of the wastewater treatment plant, which results in the sewer overflows, and it could threaten the low-lying areas of the plant, meaning if the water gets into the plant, that could lead to a failure of the plant equipment and knock them offline. That is bad for the community. Flooding could also cut off and damage lift stations, which are critical, and backup power generators, which helps them stay online. So it could be a confluence of a lot of bad things coming together. And again, that's a projected threat definition. It hasn't happened, but if it does, that's the threat exercise, the mind exercise that we're doing so that we can use that to move forward and figure out what are some strategies that we can take to protect our vulnerable assets, the ones that are in particular most vulnerable to this threat, and what would those consequences be, and eventually how can we protect them. So we're building up towards this next step, as we'll show you guys in a second. Remember Mary Jo talked about there's that final screen, or one of the final screens in module 5 of CREAT. It's called building your risk assessment, or the risk assessment dashboard. And we have just actually added our first piece to this whole thing. We've added our scenarios. Over time, we're going to add in assets. We're going to add in adaptation strategies, and that's going to give us what is in the middle, which is a monetized risk of what we think the future might look like and how to reduce that risk from a dollars and cents point of view. So we've just put in our first thing. So one of the things we want to do next is engage you guys a little bit more. So I'm going to ask Anne if you could launch our next poll question. And for everyone on the phone, you got to take note of what you're going to answer. Please write down the answers on a scrap of paper, put them in your smartphone, whatever. We'll give you 30 seconds for each one of these because they're a little bit more lengthy. So the first question is, which threat would you choose for your assessment? You can only choose one. If you could only choose one, which one do you want to do? Drought, ecosystem changes, floods, service demand, or water quality degradation? I've started the clock. You guys have another 20 seconds. So answer the poll, but remember to write down your answer because all these things are going to feed into your homework. We're helping you complete the homework, and this is going to go into your own assessment. All right, Anne, if you want to go ahead and close it. There's always going to be a thing in there for anybody that hasn't noticed. If there's something not listed, you could share it with us in the questions panel, but make sure you make note of it. So it looks like most people said drought and flood. So, okay, sounds good. And if you want to close it, we're going to launch our next poll question. So this is for the baseline scenario. What baseline scenario data would you want to include in your own assessment? I'm going to start the clock now. You can choose as many as you want here. Is it annual and monthly precip, intense precipitation, annual and monthly temp, hot day data, surface waters? Obviously, if something's not listed like coast and you want to do coast, make sure you write it down. You can share that with us in the questions panel, but more important is that you write it down. And again, everything you enter here will help you when you're doing your homework and your own assessment. All right, Ann, go ahead and close it. All right, so most people said annual, the monthly temp and precip, that's great, and the intense storm event, so fantastic. Thank you for making note of that. Next question, what time period would you select for your assessment? Same deal, we'll give you 30 seconds. You've got two choices, 2035, so this is gonna look at that model data from 2025 to 2045, or do you want to take it further out, more uncertainty, but maybe a worst case kind of thing, or you're going to replace something big in 40 years or whatever, and you want to look at what the future is going to look like then. All right, Ann, go ahead and close it. And let's take a look. Okay, 2035, that made the cut. Next and final question, what projected scenarios would you want to include in your assessment? I am starting the clock because we've talked about this a lot. So hotter, drier, warmer, wetter, more stormy, not as stormy, and surface water, and that could be lower, higher future flow. So this is you starting to think about what do you want to build out for your projected scenario. What are you concerned about? Is it hotter, drier stuff, warmer, wetter? Is it something not as stormy? Whatever it's going to be, it's all about you and no one else. All right, Ann, you can go ahead and close it, and we'll take a quick look. Kind of curious to see what this one is. Okay, a lot of more stormies, hotter, drier, also the surface water flows. So great, that's great stuff. So remember, you got to write that stuff down. It will come back, I promise. So that gets us through, I believe, all the poll questions for today. One thing we wanted to show you guys before we finish up for the day is just quickly walk through the homework assignment. So we'll just do that real quick. I'll just throw everything on the screen. Okay, starting at the top, sign up to use CREAT. If you haven't already, it's really easy. You go to that homework handout. All the stuff you need to fill out the form is there. I'll show it to you in a sec. It takes about 2 business days to get approved. Hopefully it's faster than that. Second is to import the completed file. We sent you guys a file that showed everything from Sean and his team, everything we've been showing you. It's already all completed. We want you guys to import it. You're gonna practice that function. Once you do that, that's going to let you open it and look at the tutorials for modules 2, which were all about the scenario development and all that. But we want you to be forward leaning and look at the tutorial for module 3, which is what we're going to do on Thursday. That gets us into the consequences and assets module. All you got to do is just flip through it, look at it quick. There is a video for consequences and assets. If you've got the time, it's 4 minutes. We'd love for you to watch it. Again, that's leaning forward. Number 5, you guys just answered these questions, but you're gonna write those down in your homework handout. You're gonna input them into CREAT as part of number 6, where we basically want you guys to start your own CREAT assessment, go as far as you can get using the answers you just selected. There is a new one, which is which critical asset or what critical asset would you select? And a lot of times we just want you to start thinking about it. If you pick drought, you'd probably maybe pick a well field reservoir, I don't know. Or if you pick flood, you'd pick like a plant or a lift station or a pump station that could get damaged. So we want you to narrow it down. What's a critical asset related to your to that scenario that you've built up for yourself? So that's the homework. If you have any questions, again, please let us know. We're here to help. Remember, we talked about signing up for CREAT. That's an important step. You go to create.epa.gov, you click New Users Register, and then you'll complete a form that's on the right side of the screen. You got to put in Kurt's name, his email, his phone number. All that information for Kurt is in the homework handout that we emailed to you. If you did not get it, it came from me, Alfredo with GDIT. Let us know. We'll email it to you right away after today's webinar is complete. Again, it takes about 2 business days to get approved. or faster. With that, one thing we did want to point out before we wrap up is there's going to be a CREAT exercise that's going to be held later this summer, fall. We're still trying to figure it out for a utility in Durham, North Carolina. If anybody wants, if this is interesting to you, if you like CREAT so far and you want to see somebody else, kind of another case study, you can sign up and be part of this public workshop. If you want more information about it, there's an email address at the bottom. It's Alyssa Hall at cadmusgroup.com. They're working with EPA, Kurt, Steve, and others to put this on, and it's going to cover CREAT, but also like how does it apply to Durham. If you want to see more and learn more about other people and how they're using CREAT, we wanted to make this available to you. We'll point it out again after each of the sessions. Finally, closing remarks. Our next session is this Thursday, June 17th, same time, 10 to 12. It's only 2 hours. It's this Thursday. We're going to cover modules 3 and 4. We're looking forward to working with you guys on Thursday. If you need any help, there's the box at the bottom here on the slide. This is the same information in your homework handout. Please, please reach out to Kurt. You can call him, you can email him. Hit us up via the crew help desk email, or use the questions panel now. I might actually put Mary Jo Krikorian on the spot, ask Mary Jo to please come off mute and see if you can inform us of any big questions that may have come up that might be worth sharing with everybody.
We did get the question on the type of utility options, if stormwater was an option, but I wrote in the answer panel that the only options to select are water only, wastewater only, combined water, or combined wastewater.
Okay, so yeah, so there's no stormwater option, I guess, currently
Correct.
in CREAT. I guess, Mary Jo, I want to put you on the spot.
Mhm.
Somebody that does want to do stormwater, any suggestions? Should they do like wastewater only, combined wastewater?
Oh,
Have you seen
I
anything
would,
in your history?
yeah, that's kind of like you said, a head scratcher. I think you would have to think about what asset you wanted to consider and what threat, and sort of go with that tact, depending on as we will get into next session, the asset threat pair that you are going to analyze. You might want to have a bigger focus or a bigger wastewater focus.
Okay. With that, I guess I'm going to ask Anne if you can go ahead and close out the webinar. We'll see everyone on Thursday. So thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.